Hi everyone, so this is the first in a series of tutorials on the Python game development environment called Pygame. Just to show you what we will achieve by the end of the tutorials, we'll look at how to create sprites, how to add music and input and effects, and how to create the basis of a game. So this here is a spaceship shooter, and by the end of the tutorials we should get up to this point. But really, I'm aiming to simply give you a foundation for using Pygame. It's up to you how you then take that foundation and actually develop your own game from it. For my own students, I want them to use my template, and I have created a series of lessons on my GitHub. So I'll just show you where my GitHub is. You'll actually find that this is my GitHub repository here, and I have a series of lessons inside it. For my students, they will be using this template, the lesson 1 template, for developing their own games, which is part of their projects. But as we go through the various tutorials and lessons, you'll find that there is a branch that's been set up for each one. And if you get left behind, you can always move to that particular branch. Okay, so what is Pygame? Well, Pygame is quite a popular 2D game development environment. And if you go to the Pygame site, you'll actually find a whole lot of different games that people have actually created using Pygame. Unlike some other environments, it is primarily code-based and code-driven, which is why it's particularly good for school students learning to code, because it'll actually teach you concepts such as object-oriented coding, and it'll also help you develop your Python coding skills. So I highly recommend it, because object-oriented coding is, well, it's where it's at. You really should learn how to code using objects. Okay, so I'm currently on my lesson 1 branch of my GitHub repository. So you can either download a zip folder of that repository. The other way to go about it is to actually clone the branch itself. So if you wanted to, and I'll just get my terminal working. I'm not sure why VS Code has a problem these days, but for some reason it doesn't seem to work first go for me. I don't know why. All right, so in terminal, if you want to install Pygame, you can actually just go pip3 install Pygame. So you can see there, that's the command down there, pip3 install Pygame. And if you wish to clone my GitHub account, you can actually go git clone https://github.com/bradnielsen2981/pygame_template. At least I think that's what the URL is. So you can always go here and get, oh, it's dash. You can always just copy and paste it there. So if you do have Git installed on your computer, you could always run that line of code, git clone, and that will actually set up my GitHub. I don't know why it's actually, for some reason, it has mashed together the URLs. There you go, that's it. So that's the line of code you need. Otherwise, download a zip folder from GitHub itself. Okay, now once you have my code, you'll find this is the file structure. There are a lot of empty files at the moment, and as we go through the tutorials, we will be coding those files. But the main execution point is main.py, and I've already put in the very basic code that you require to create a Pygame window. So just to give you a bit of a quick overview, I'm going to import the Pygame library. I'm then going to import in some Pygame constants. And what I mean by constants is certain things like, for example, a key up value is saved as a constant. So when we refer to key up, we're actually referring to like a numerical number, but I'm going to import in those as constants. You'll see what I mean as we go along. I'm also going to import some very basic libraries, which is OS, sys, random, time, math, just things that will help us. And then the last thing I'm going to import is I'm actually going to create a file where I can save my own global variables. And you're probably wondering, why would I save my own global variables in its own file? Well, because I'm using multiple Python files, as you can see on the left here, if I want those Python files to be able to access the same global variables, I need to save them somewhere. And this is what I've referred to as, with my students, as namespaces. If we save our variables within a namespace, we can then import those variables using that namespace. So game globals is a list of global variables. A lot of them we're not even using yet, but later on we will. And when we refer to them, because I'm importing game globals and I use the keyword as, I'm giving it an alias of game. So what that means is that if I want to refer to a variable inside game, I just go game dot, means access the namespace, and then you can see some of the global variables I have created. And so, look, it'll become super useful later on. I just thought we'd set it up from the beginning. So some of this code you don't need to understand, but it's just, for us, it's a means to get started really. And that way I don't have to play catch up later on. All right, the next step is this initialization code. To initialize Pygame, you need to call its init function. So we've imported in the Pygame library, and then I go pygame.init. That will get it so that it's setting up all the things like controlling display and so forth. I'm going to also set up some music and sound. So I need to go pygame.mixer.init. That will initialize sound. And I'm also going to allow it so Pygame can display text and fonts. So I need to initialize its font engine. So those three things basically initialize the entire Pygame game engine. Next, I set a display. I'm going to set the size of my display to 1024 by 768, but obviously it really depends what type of game you're doing, what the width of your display will be, and also depends on the resolution of your computer as well. This is just setting a caption, so I set it as caption for the window. And then I do create these global variables, but I'm not saving those global variables in my game globals. I'm actually just going to have them there. I don't actually refer to them again, except for when I'm typing out text. So I don't actually, if I needed these global variables inside another file, I would save them inside game, but I'm not going to, so I'll just leave them there. So I create a clock. I create a font, that's the font manager, and I also create and load a background image. These three global variables I am going to store inside my game.globals file. You can see that I'm going to store what's called a Pygame surface, and Pygame refers to displays as surfaces. A surface is simply like an off-screen display buffer where you can save different pixels and drawings and so on, and then at a certain point we flip it onto the actual monitor. So a surface is simply a way of being able to draw. We draw on a surface and then we show that surface on our screens. I've also set this global variable, game.exit. I've created this global variable and I've saved it inside game.globals. I've set it to false. This will actually control the running of our game, and you'll see that in a second. Finally, I also say what the state of my game is in. These variables I just created, by the way. I just made up a name and said, okay, well, I need a variable that determines if I'm going to exit my game. I'm going to need a variable to determine the state of my game. Right. this is where things get interesting. And one of the things about Pygame is it's actually very good for beginner programmers who wish to understand game programming, because most game programming involves the idea of a game loop. A game loop is a way of getting the computer to simply update its objects and gets user input, updates the game objects, and then displays those objects. So most games that require animation have a game loop in them. And you'll see that my particular game loop is going to keep running until game.exit is set to true, which is why I created that variable there. So while game.exit is equal to false, it's going to continue running this block of indented code. And the parts of my loop will be getting input, looking for events and input. So you can see I collect the user input here. And actually drawing on the screen. And then this last line here, display.flip. In fact, what I mean to say is the game.screen is simply a surface that we draw on. Display.flip says show that surface on your actual monitor. And that's an important concept because oftentimes we draw off screen on the surface, and only when we're ready do we flip it onto the monitor. But the important thing to realize here is that this game loop is actually running at 60 frames per second. And I have managed to control that by typing clock.tick 60. So that simply sets my frame rate. And now it's going to be running this loop. It's going to do all the things in this loop at 60 frames per second. And each time it updates the display. So that's just a bit of theory about game development. And I've got a little picture here that I just wanted to show you. This is at the very heart of a game, is it processes the input, updates the game, renders to the screen. The clock there just indicates that the actual computer regulates the time between frames. So you can imagine how this is our while loop. It's just going to keep running those things, process input, update game, render. Process input, update game, render. And if it goes too fast, it will actually just slow it down a little bit. So it wants to make sure that the frame rate is regular so that things on the screen don't appear jittery. So jitter will occur if you don't regulate your frame rate. And Pygame lets you regulate your frame rate by typing in clock.tick. Okay, I'm not going to go into some of this stuff yet. We will be looking at it in later lessons. But what I thought we would do is just do a couple of things just to conclude this tutorial. One, if I actually run the code, and you can run your code now, you can see that I'm actually filling the screen with the color blue. And colors in Pygame are represented using 3 values, being each out of 255, 255, 255. This is known as RGB color. So R being the first value, G being the second value, and B being the third value. And if you ever want to just play around, and I'd recommend you do so, just change some of these values so it's somewhere between 0 and 255, and you'll get the idea of what RGB color is. But what we're going to do is we're going to hide that, comment it out. Instead, what we're going to do is we're actually going to blit our background image. So before I went into my game loop, I loaded up a background image. And that background image is a starry background I downloaded from Pygame. So I went to Pygame and I downloaded this starry background. You can see the credits for that. And then I've just changed the color to the color purple because I didn't like the orange too much. And I have saved that inside my images folder, which is there. And instead of actually just having a screen.fill, instead I'm going to blit that background image. Blit is a key word in Pygame. It simply means put those pixels onto the surface. So game.screen is the Pygame surface. I'm going to blit the background image. And in fact, it's the first thing I'll ever draw. That way, anytime I do drawing afterwards, will go on top of that image. Okay, so now I have starry backgrounds, and I'll play that. There you go, there's my starry background. And the final thing I'm going to do is because this is occurring at 60 frames per second, I need a way of actually determining where I am in my game. For example, what if I'm actually only just starting my game, or I'm getting ready to start my game? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to test to see if the game.state is equal to start game. And it should, because I set it up here. Game.state is start game. So long as it's the start game, it's going to run the code directly below it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually create a line of text. So font.render, welcome to Pygame. True is for anti-aliasing, which means it blends the pixels on the outside so it looks a bit smoother. And then you can see that the color I have given it, is kind of like a grayish kind of color. So I create the text using the font manager, and then I'm going to blit that. So it's going to blit the text on top of the background. The background was blitted first, and then it's going to blit the text on top of it. And the sequence you blit is very important. If I blitted the background image after blitting the text, then I'm never ever going to see the text, am I? So now I can actually see the text. And you can see it says, welcome to Pygame. And then what I'm going to do is, and I'll just make it so I'm going to wrap my view so you can see this. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to alter that a little bit. And instead of actually blitting that text, I'm actually going to blit the coordinates from my mouse. So all I've done is I've created a variable called coord, and the coord is a font render. I'm going to create an X and a Y value, or at least I'm going to get the string of the X and Y value from my mouse, and I get my mouse up here. We'll talk more about this thing called a vector2 later on, so don't worry if you don't understand exactly where it's coming from at the moment. But what you do need to know is that we can actually have it so that the screen will keep updating with the current mouse position. So I'm going to create text that includes the mouse's position, and again I'm going to blit that to the screen. So now I'm just going to save and press run, and now you'll see that in terms of positioning, the very top left of my screen is 0, 0, and the very bottom of my screen is 1024 by 768. So that gives you an idea about how the coordinate system in Pygame works. The middle is not 0, 0, which is what you would be familiar with in mathematics. The actual middle is the top left of the screen, or at least the origin is 0, 0, all the way to 1024 by 768. Okay, that's going to conclude the tutorial, and in the next tutorial we'll actually create a button. Thank you very much for listening.